It is the first day of a new season. Let's take a look at the season pass card, Ensabanur. Ensabanur demos the release of the new keyword objective. He is a 4/5 with an objective that when you have filled all of your front row slots, he transforms into a 4/8 Apocalypse Celestial's Chosen. Upon that transformation, he will swap the lowest power card that you have at any of your front row slots with something in your deck. This is an ability that is very reminiscent of Blink, but targeted the other way. Rather than having the card that you get be the part that they added power into, the card that you are targeting is the card that they sort of made a little bit more focused. But when you actually compare her with what Blink is capable of, or I should say him, this is a card that I think comes up a little bit short. This is a card that, when compared to its closest competitor, just doesn't have the oomph that it needs in order to compete in what this metagame currently is about. This is a very mid-rangey card. You're not really duplicating its effect in any meaningful way, and what it's getting, being the part that isn't being specified, means that very often it's going to be particularly unsplashy. Now, if we were still in a world where we could pretend that 4/8 was good stats, then maybe that would be a different conversation. But I don't think we can be in that world. Largely, the thing this card the most is a 4/8 Lockjaw, and when you play it and purchase it and look for it, those are kind of the spaces that you're gonna be looking for. Is there something you have done in deck building to guarantee that you're getting what you want to get out of this when you get it? Now, you do have some reasonable control over it. Like, a lot of the time, you'll be able to trigger this late enough in the game that you've got a pretty good idea of what's happening. This is a card that does benefit from having a deck tracker. But mostly, the biggest point of comparison that strikes me between this and Blink is that if you imagine them on a spectrum with Lockjaw on the far left and then Blink on the far right, and in between them is Apocalypse, he's just a lot closer to Lockjaw than he is to Blink, because Blink has such a higher ability to guarantee a high impact card come out, whereas this guy is just going to fail some amount of the time. Like, yeah, it's cool that you got rid of the hood. It's cool that you got rid of your -9 void. That stuff is fine. It's a very reasonable use case for this card that Lockjaw cannot have. But outside of that, mostly what it's doing is turning a 1-drop into something that could not be a 1-drop, but also could be, because you're probably playing 1-drops to make this happen. So with all of that in mind, it's pretty difficult to find a place where I think he's like a genuine upgrade to a deck, but I do think that this is probably the most plausible one. Including him in the Quicksilver Domino version of the Afflict deck means that you effectively just get to turn Quicksilver into a card that actually matters. Now, this is a sort of example of how you're building around this guy's effect. One way to make sure that you're actually getting something valuable out of it is to just not play anything that isn't valuable. Everything in this deck is something you would want to turn a Quicksilver into. You're very happy to turn a Quicksilver into basically any of these cards, and that's a pretty solid and powerful thing to be doing. You even have a Malekith that can, in theory, do a little bit of deck thinning for you. This is a deck that is very keyed in on specific combinations of 3s and 4s, and it is a place that actually uses Ensabanur additively. The downside is that it's still an Afflict deck, and it's always going to be a little bit capped by being that. This is a deck that is very straightforward, and people pretty much have a good idea of what you're doing. But if the metagame gets just a slight bit more mid-rangey, Afflict has always been a deck that is particularly potent at dealing with mid-range metagames. Of course, the other downside here is I'm not entirely sure the Wiccan Afflict deck is the best Afflict deck to play, and this guy does seem like he actually cares quite a bit about the specific configuration of this deck compared to other things in the space. This is a deck that is a lot of proactive 3s that you're happy to turn a Quicksilver into, and really no use for the Quicksilver in itself other than activating the Wiccan, where something like a version of the deck playing the Shang-Chi's Rings, a more typical Quicksilver Wiccan kind of deck, well, it might not get the same thing out of what this guy's doing. A slightly modified Roram shell here. This is the Sasquatch Mockingbird list, but of course I have put a show loud a Maverick in there because I am nothing if not a hack. Now, what this deck is doing is just saying that we don't run enough bad cards in here that we're actually unhappy to get rid of a Mysterio or something of that nature. There are a couple of things going on here, but mostly it's like, okay, I'll get rid of the hood. I'm very happy to do that. I'm the kind of deck that is willing to play this kind of stuff anyway. I'll just sort of Mysterio on 5, and then he'll get something interesting and nice out of the deck for me, and if it won't be a Mysterio going away, it'll be a hood going away, and I just like having the option to have this card get rid of the hood, and all of that basically is true. I think that this is a pretty straightforward inclusion here, where I do think that, like, if you're playing a deck like this that is doing the Mysterio Merlin thing, and you're interested in the way this deck goes about itself, yeah, I can see this being a really compelling way to do this. Now, obviously, a lot of your best plays are just going to be something like, you know, play Mysterio on turn 5, and then play a Maverick, and then you show allow the Maverick, and play a 1-cost gigantic Sasquatch. That's a lot of what this deck is, but you can sort of meaningfully supplement that plan with Ensabanur if you so feel the need. Another direction you can go with this is to have him go fish out or get other things. This is another example of how he's a lot closer to a Lockjaw than a Blink. This deck is just playing him as a second Lockjaw. You're very happy to have some ability to throw away some zeros and get some other things out of there. That's pretty much the extent of what he's doing here. You're looking to just sort of play him when you don't have Beta Ray Bill, things like that, or even when you don't have Jane Foster. Really, if you're missing any part of the 4-5 part of your Thor curve, you're like, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And then you play some zeros in an Aurora, and it's like a pretty nice thing to do. And it's also worth talking about how, like, if you flip the Apocalypse, the objective is no longer on the Apocalypse. He's an on-reveal card now. You should be able to hit him with the Aurora. Things of that nature are like, it's not bad, right? Like, it's not bad. The problem is you're not gonna flip the Apocalypse before 6 a lot of the time, so you kind of end up losing out on that. But if you can, it does help. Now, this is a deck that has some pretty straightforward and powerful things about it. Like, there's definitely good things going on here. I like that it's a deck that does a lot with its stats that doesn't necessarily fold to CGR right now. Cosmic Ghost Rider is a card I really expect to start picking up as part of this metagame, in part because of the new objective cards, but also just in part, and largely, I would say, due to the rise in various Iska decks. It just seems like Cosmic Ghost Rider is a pretty good answer, so being a deck that sort of naturally dodges that is a reasonable and compelling place to be. I think that largely this is a deck that is still missing a little bit of oomph, and while I do consider him additive here, I don't necessarily consider him additive enough. When they update, presumably, I'm talking like it's gonna happen. I'm just very mad if they don't. Please update Aurora to do this. You know what I mean? Like, please, can you update Aurora to hit objective cards? Come on. That's like her whole thing. Like, come on. Just let me have this, right? People often put Zoo up there with like archetypes like Destroy and Discard and things like that. And I think that's sort of a category error. Like, Zoo is not an archetype the way Move and Destroy and Discard and all those other early game archetypes are. Zoo is just the name for what the efficient points package in Series 1 is, in large part because that efficient points package rotates around Khazar, and because we imported a decent amount of Magic players for whom a deck that is playing a bunch of cheap beaters is a Zoo deck. And so that terminology has just sort of stuck around. But I think people look at it and they're like, damn, I wish Zoo could be viable again. But I think that's the wrong way to look at what Zoo is. Zoo is the first efficient points package that you'll ever run into. That's what it is. Every other deck is a theme deck when you're playing through Marvel Snap in the early going. You're doing a themed thing. Zoo is the first time you're like, I am just building around a couple of cards to make all my other cards better. I'm going to do an efficient points package of Khazar and Blue Marvel and a bunch of dudes, right? That's what this deck actually is, and that is why it is so hard to be like, oh, it's a Zoo card for really anything, right? Because there are a lot more efficient points packages as you get farther into the game. That's actually like kind of what the game is. It's about having more efficient points packages than friggin' Zoo. And so I bring this up to say that, like, every so often people will be like, oh, it's a Zoo card, or I wish they'd make Zoo good. And I think that is misunderstanding what Zoo is. It is putting it in the category of archetypes that it does not belong in. It's just a word for an efficient points package that exists at early game, right? And so with all of that said, Ensabanur is pretty good in decks that we would reasonably describe as Zoo, but these points packages just simply aren't efficient enough for you to do a lot with them. This is probably, if I'm being fully transparent here, I suspect it to be a little bit worse than just playing the Blink Zoo with M'Baku. Like, this is fine, but it's just not good enough. It's like a tier 3 points package that you kind of have to go out of your way to make work, and it's because it is Marvel Snap. If you're playing a points package on points package game, you can always win those games, right? But Zoo has a sort of remarkable lack of ability to customize itself to metagames because its points package is less efficient than some of the ones that you get later on in the game. And so that naturally lends itself to like calcifying a little bit. It's going to be just points more often than not. And this is another example of that. Like, you're going to have to go power to power with things that are probably better at going power to power than you are. One interesting piece of overlap between all three of the new cards that released is actually that they do some pretty weird stuff with having specific costs or specific powers on the board. Iska, for example, loves having a lane that you are losing by a pretty decent amount, especially if you can make that lane no longer losing. Sentry and Hood can provide that, right? You also have Juggernaut, who benefits from different powers on the board. Hood is a -3 and also a 1/6. Sentry is a 4/9 and also a -9. Provides that as well. And of course, Ensabanur wants targets to flip away and also wants locations to be full. So things that make multiple bodies are pretty beneficial there as well. So you get a deck that is a pretty straightforward addition or multiplication of these kind of synergies, and it looks something like this. There are two major problems here. The first is that this is not a lot of points, and that when you run into things like Show Lao or you run into the Iska decks doing Invisible Woman stuff, you kind of just get shoved in a locker because you're playing an extremely fair game. So unless you're able to meaningfully clog them up, you're kind of just going to lose to the people who aren't playing an extremely fair game. That's sort of what the Pixie stuff is in here to do, is be like, what if I was also being a little unfair? It does not strike me as compelling enough to make this deck really compete with the unfair decks, unfortunately. Pixie's time as a meaningful cheater is not necessarily over, but there's just a lot of things that can play you straight up without any energy cheat and come away with more points than you, even if you are energy cheating. And that is an awkward situation to be in. This is a deck that has some really powerful things to do, but it doesn't have enough consistent access to those things, and what it has access to consistently is fairly mediocre output. If Thanos wasn't Thanos, I would really think this was like if Thanos was good, this would be a good deck, right? Like, this is another place where Ensabanur is definitely additive. Like, what is the worst case scenario for Ensabanur? You go get another stone, dope. Love that. Like, I'm super happy with that, right? Like, there's just not many bad use cases for a guy that's going to do what this deck is going to do. But it's also like, okay, so what are you going to do for me? What are you going to bring to this deck other than being, like, kind of nice? Why am I playing you instead of, Stardust, right? And you kind of just start asking yourself that question a lot until you end up putting Stardust in this deck, is basically my experience. You're just sitting there like, okay, well, this could be a Stardust. Then you kind of like, oh, well, what if it is a Stardust? What if I just go ahead and do that, right? And so this is another situation, actually, where like the decks that Ensabanur kind of wants to be in, I think that like the best case for this card is that it wants to be in Aurora decks, right? But it abjectly does not want to be in Aurora decks unless you are consistently flipping it beforehand. And so, again, I make my plea to Second Dinner, let my people go, dude. Like, let her target objective cards, please. I beg of you, because it just feels like Apocalypse is sort of like a mid-range sludge card right now, and mid-range sludge is sort of typified by Aurora in this current metagame. I would like to see your mid-range sludge card work with the mid-range sludge that is good. I would like to see that. I think that is a good direction for this card. So where does that leave Ensabanur? I think it leaves him mostly in a fairly medium spot. Ensabanur, you might say. This guy is not great. He's a card not just out of time, but out of place. This is a card that is not meant for the current world of Marvel Snap. It's a very like mid-range sludge card that is not in a mid-range sludge world. And the mid-range sludge that does exist, Aurora stuff, it kind of explicitly doesn't work with the front half of him, which disincentivizes me from even trying. Really, the Blink comparison is the most salient one, where they clearly looked at this card and they said, we don't want to put the power on the output here. We're going to make it target the input. But the problem is when you play Lockjaw normally, you're targeting the input anyway. You don't put your big guy into a Lockjaw. That is already something that the card has access to. And so I think that they thought that this was a bigger upgrade over a Lockjaw than it actually was. But this card is 5% better than a Lockjaw. This is 5% better than a 4/8 Lockjaw, right? And if you wouldn't play a 4/8 Lockjaw, I'm not really sure where you'd play this guy. And so you kind of end up with a card that thinks it's Blink, but is actually Lockjaw. And I think that that is the kind of thing where it's like, this is better than that, but it's not that much better than that, such that you really want to go out of your way and be like, I'm going to do all the things this card is asking me to do in order to receive the result of 4/8 Lockjaw. And yeah, it's a little bit of an oversimplification, but I think it accurately conveys what this card is and what it is trying to do. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps me out. And as always, have a wonderful evening.